Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here today. Can we get the first slide? Almost. We're almost there. Perfect. Thank you so much. So the focus of my work really is around this idea of how computers can look across the world and help us peer into the soul of what it means to be human. To look across the world's rich, diverse societies and narratives, to look at not what divides us and tears us apart, but what brings us together as a world. And to visualize those stories, whether it's social media or books or academic literature or even Wikipedia. And this led to this question, this vision of, well, what if we could take everything said across the entire planet on a single day and visualize the global conversation? A vision today which spans more than 400 languages. Television is one of those fascinating areas that AI has had the biggest impact on. Our ability to look at video. The Internet Archive's Television News Archive spans 100 channels from 50 countries, 100 channels from 50 countries, for over 5 continents, over portions of the last 20 years. But journalists and scholars historically have never been able to look at these archives, to try to understand our shared world, because we've lacked the tools that can look across speech and imagery from across the entire planet. Now, television is particularly powerful to try to understand our world. If you look at this image here, so this is how often each country in the world was talked about on American television news from 2009 to 2016. Now, if you look at this image, now this is Google searches by Americans in 2016. They're the same thing. Now, this is fascinating. This doesn't tell us whether news drives searches or vice versa, but it tells us that what the news talks about is what people search about. So television is a particularly powerful lens through which to understand the world. Now, how do we use television to try to understand the world? Well, we can just keyword search the transcripts. So we can do things like this. We can look at, for example, how often Gaza is mentioned on American television news and a selection of global news. And we can see the slow decline in coverage of what's happening in Gaza. Or we can look at, for example, the on-screen text. And of course, former President Trump in the United States, he liked to tweet, as you may have heard. And so we scanned American television news for every appearance of his tweets on television. And we're actually able to use this to show that every time Twitter flagged one of his tweets and said, this is false, that amplified it and drove the news cycle the following day. And so it turns out he learned this, and he learned that all he had to do was tweet something that was blatantly false. Twitter would fact check it, and the entire following day would be coverage of that. So he could literally remote control our entire media system. We could also do powerful things like connect the online and the offline world. So CNN broadcast this clip during COVID and just said, somewhere in Russia. So we took that clip, scanned the entire internet, and was able to find the original source of that and the complete description of it. Now, this is powerful because a lot of falsehoods that are out there, they're real material in the incorrect context. So this ability to connect, to lend provenance to the information we're consuming. Now, starting with the invasion of Ukraine, the Internet Archive began monitoring Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian television. And we've been live transcribing and translating that material so that journalists and scholars can study the domestic narrative. How is these stories being told? And then something amazing happened. New tools for speech recognition came out. So instead of dozens of languages, we can now recognize hundreds of languages, and particularly multiple languages. So this is a clip from Chinese television. English, Arabic, and Mandarin, all in 60 seconds, and all of it transcribed. We've never had tools before that could do things like that. Now, of course, what makes television so interesting is the visual dimension. So we've been using AI to look through the visual dimension of television. So one thing is simply, we took a year of Russian television and folded it on itself. Took each second and compared it to every other second. So we could actually trace how clips were being reused. But then we could also find common metaphors, so visual themes, color schemes, and visual styles that are used to convey certain tones on television. But a more interesting question, of course, is who's telling the story? So we were asked, how often does Tucker Carlson appear on Russian television? So we facial scanned Russian television, made a timeline up there. But then we said, it's not really how often he appears on television. It's who's telling the story on Russian television. And so we took one episode of 60 Minutes, it's a show on Russian television, extracted out every human face, and faces that appeared on screen together, we made into a network. But then we scaled it up even further. We looked at an entire year of it. 50,000 minutes of airtime, 250,000 human faces, and you can see Olga, she's the main presenter there in the center. So it's ability to really visualize at scale who's telling the stories that we see. Now, of course, it's not just who's telling the stories, it's what stories are they telling. So computer vision, like computer tools that can understand vision, historically recognize about 30,000 objects and activities. And so this was enough to say, during COVID, what's different about television compared to pre-pandemic? The answer, bookcases. And we can do interesting things. So every day we scan global imagery for disaster imagery, so we can sort of ground truth what's happening around the world. And it's enough on Russian television to track the density of military imagery. So you can see in the beginning the invasion, and then as they lost ground, and then as they began regaining. You can actually see that reflected in there. But that's still very limiting. So along came tools where you can actually type in a description in plain English of what you want, and the machine will find imagery that matches that, like soldier in front of a Russian flag. But you're still limited to, to a human typing it. So what about the inverse? So we handed one of these new machines, a picture of a golden retriever and said, describe it. Everything you see there was generated by a machine. This is where we're at today, what machines can do for us. But that's still one image. So we had a machine watch an entire day of Russian television and describe what it was seeing second by second. And then, during the Turkish earthquake, we experimented and we said, what would it look like to have a machine absorb all this information coming from across the world and summarize it, basically? And you can see, it actually looks pretty good. This is all done by a machine. But of course, that's still a textual summary. And what we probably want to do is codify that. So we also said, give me all the different material and just make a table of it. And so this is literally the machine just looking at everything pouring across the global newsphere and summarizing that. And then we can break it down to customized summaries, such as medical and search and rescue information. Break it down by organization. We could even have it fact-check it. So we can say, here are known falsehoods. Scan all this material and automatically write counter-narratives completely in real time. But that's still factual information. It turns out machines can read between the lines just like we can. And so here we had a machine. We said, take everything said yesterday about China, country by country, summarize it. Tell me whether it portrays China as strong or weak, whether it's good for my country or bad for my country. This is where we're at. Machines can actually do this type of stuff now. You can even do specialized things, like, for example, summarize global investment in Turkey yesterday. The ability for machines to just absorb so much material and distill it down for us. But still, that's still, why summarize? Like, why care about this? Because we want to do something with that. Well, we took a machine and we said, pretend you're the US State Department. And we had it watch Iranian television day in, day out, and look for any mention of the nuclear accord and counter it according to the American narrative. What you see here, this is all generated by a machine. And this is either incredibly powerful or incredibly scary, depending on where you sit. But automated diplomacy is here. It even generates imagery to go with each of those stories. Now, translation, now remember I said English and Persian. It's amazing. These tools, we're not Google Translate anymore. These newer tools can generate translations that are human-like fluency. But not just across languages. You can stay within a language. You can say, here's something in English, convert this to a different audience. For example, maybe children or a particular constituency. You can even say, here is my corporate voice, like here's the style guide for my organization, and have it rewrite it in the same language but in a different voice. All this is possible today. But here's where things get really interesting. So we took a day of Iranian television, foreign and domestic television for them, and we extracted out an image every few seconds. And we made this visualization of one day of Iranian television. And you can dive in, you can actually see how they're telling the Ghazian story. And it's really fascinating as you start looking at what are the visual narratives? How much imagery are they showing? How much are they telling the story through images versus through people telling the story? And it turns out there's some fascinating trends there. but that's one country on one day. How about 3 countries on one day? Russia, China, and Iran. And it turns out there are 3 parallel media universes, almost no similarities between them. But as you dive further, it turns out they're telling the same stories, but from such different perspectives, you wouldn't even know they're telling the same story. So it just reminds us how much our unique media ecosystems define how we see the world, and that we need to look beyond our own lenses, especially in the West. But that's still 3 channels on one day. What if we took the entire planet on one day? So this is one entire day of everything that we monitor across the entire planet. Every tendril there, an arc of stories. And then we can scale up and look at 3 different days, and we can see they look a lot alike with some differences. We can start seeing the fundamental patterns of our entire global media ecosystem. Now we're way up here, basically. Now we can dive into one tiny corner there and see one day of global COVID vaccine coverage. And we can actually start diving into this and seeing the first glimmers of tomorrow's falsehoods. And they actually are galaxies. They're basically falsehoods emerge, and they hit each other, and they pull apart. They start blending together. And we can visualize that. But then we can dive further to the people, the places, the things that define those stories. And even further to the words that are used to describe those stories. And then even further to the influencers that are driving those stories. Now, we can dive even further and look at the overall tone of the entire planet's media over the last quarter century, and we can see it's pretty stable until the 1990s. This was the rise of the web. As the web rose, media across the entire planet began competing with each other. And so suddenly, that's where we start seeing this surge of negativity, of hyperbole, of extreme language. And so really, it wasn't social media that made the world a dark place. It was the rise of the web itself. And then we can actually start visualizing how the world's media portrays every country on Earth. Not how people in those countries feel, but how the world's media portrays them. You can see there's a lot wrong with this picture. And then we can actually start looking at the fundamental patterns of media. This is powerful because we can take a story that's emerging right now and we can analyze it and tell you whether this is an organic story or whether it's being driven by propaganda forces across the world. We can then dive even further and look at the earliest glimmers of tomorrow's biggest stories and even forecast what's to come. And in fact, the first alert of COVID actually came from our data when it was still a SARS-like viral pneumonia of unknown origin. But I want to leave you with a note of caution. So you're hearing a lot right now about the hype and the hyperbole of AI. And you're hearing a lot right now about machines, they're going to take over and, enslave humanity. And you're seeing a lot of these demos. The challenge with these is they're like a roulette wheel. Every time you run it, you might end up with a brilliant answer that's incredible. The next time you run it, it'll be complete gibberish. That's because these machines, they're not really thinking. They're just basically generating things that kind of look like language. And so every time you see one of these stories of, my God, this machine did this amazing feat of superhuman intelligence, it's probably not what you think. Now, the real danger is the simple things. These machines, they make things up. The Chinese spy balloon, we had a machine, one of the big, actually I think it was ChatGPT, summarize that. It became a thermonuclear capable hypersonic missile aimed at the American homeland. In one summary, America lie in ruins and our submarines were going to sea to strike back. This is a real problem. It's great if you're a Hollywood filmmaker. It's a real problem if you're trying to use these tools to summarize the news. And bias is a big issue I want to mention here. These tools are being made by largely Western companies with Western values encoded in them. So that means in particular when you ask them things like about, for example, something like Islam, the answers, what they will give you, the answers that they give you and what they will refuse to talk about reflect how an American Western company views the rest of the world. And this is a real problem as we start applying these tools to the entire planet. And I want to thank you so much. It's been a true honor to be here today. I know I've covered a tremendous amount of material really fast, but I hope this has given you a first glimpse of what becomes possible tomorrow as these AI tools continue to evolve. Thank you so very much.